And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room with us tonight. And we have Carolyn Goida out there running the Ideas Room. It's great to see so many of you. We're going to do a special X State of the Union tonight. And we've got incoming a massive snowstorm. So we are not joined by the lovely Olivia, but she's coming back for the two blockbuster episodes of the X series that are going to hit next week and the following week. And they are going to be some serious revelations are contained in there. And so that's something which I'm going to hint at tonight and give a big teaser for as I'm giving the State of the Union tonight, which I'm going to really show the trends for 2022 and all the things that we're looking at. And it really, I mean, this is for the work that we've been doing here over the past 4 years in the X series. This is really like 2022 is just right on time because as I read the headlines, it feels more and more like the show. Isn't that terrifying? But I also want to point out that with this X series State of the Union tonight, we're going to be doing something very interesting where right now, the year has started off at this pivot point. And of course, this also highlights the fact that President Joe Stepford Biden does not give State of the Unions. Apparently, he just hangs out with a green screen in the back. And he's been stumbling very seriously and stumbling in the polls. And he's been having a real issue, I would say, trying to convince people that he should have been in there in the first place. And so is his VP. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of leadership is this? This was the really top-down leadership approach that they took, and they put Stepford Biden in there because they thought he'll just do whatever we say. And he's been hanging out there on the fringes, but the man was not cognitively ready for the job because his cognitive faculties are just gone. And so we've heard all those stories and things about him and the storm drug and the different things that they've tried to overcome with him. But apparently this drug that they give him to make him snappy at these press conferences also makes him angry. So you notice him flipping out all the time. And so we have two of the least favorite politicians right now, Joe, and of course our friend to the north, Justin Castro Trudeau. Trudeau, you know, it's interesting as he faces, there's this massive now revolt in the country driven by the truckers. And they've had it with the ridiculous mandates, which are completely fascist. And they really overplayed their hand on the government side. In Canada, of course, they've been doing it in America. In Australia, we've seen them putting up camps and all the rest. So and I love the defenses for those camps. They're not exact; they're camps, but they're not concentration camps. How slippery a slope is that? So we're going to get into that tonight. But there's something that's happening here, which is the plans of the World Economic Forum and a number of their leaders that they put out there, like Trudeau. It's not working because the facade is fine, but when you hit on the ground, and Parliament is encircled, you know, by these intense caravans and convoys, then, you know, I think he said something along the line, Trudeau, that, I think I may have tested, you know, I was around, like I was exposed to COVID, and I tested negative, so I'm going underground for 5 days. No, you're just getting away from, you know, the angry crowds who really, you know, the government there is in a very precarious position, I would say, because of the incredible overreach. And again, we've seen this overreach in states like California, New York, and it doesn't end very well for the leaders. In fact, I mean, look in some ways at Gretchen Whitmer, who was really, you know, kind of up and coming on the Democratic side, and then said, oh, you can't buy seeds, and became a real fascist during the 2020 lockdowns. The same thing with Gavin Newsom, who was the governor of California. He was the one saying, hey, I could pull martial law if I want to. No, you can't. Constitution kind of prevents that from happening. But we've seen these people kind of really recede. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer, you hardly ever hear of anymore. And they did their piece, but they became incredibly unpopular as a result. Newsom, although he was able to maintain his position as governor there, it's by a very thin thread driven by the Pelosi mafia gang. So Trudeau now is facing his moment with all this, where they said, hey, rifle through all this fascist stuff and you'll be a king. We promise. And then he rifles it all through, and he does weird stuff, like he does TV commercials where he tells kids to tell their parents to step out of the room because he has something to tell them. Not exactly wholesome TV there. But if you actually run the numbers on Trudeau, it's very interesting because his group, the Liberal group there in Canada, has the lowest actual vote totals for any ruling party in their history. It's at 32%. And those are vote totals, not poll numbers, which are a lot lower. Like with Stepford Biden, Biden has some of the lowest poll numbers since Herbert Hoover or Nixon on the way out. So we're looking at these, activities, and this is the kind of stuff where you can see a huge shift may occur on the ground, and they're counting on the fact on the establishment side. We have the media, we have the ability to hypnotize so many people, and we have this narrative running, but it's shown so many cracks that something like this trucker convoy, which is gaining and gaining and gaining. We have something like 100,000 trucks involved. So we're talking about a mass movement, and this is what they've been building on underneath, because they didn't fold their cards and run in the fall as they should have, because they had accomplished a lot. The World Economic Forum with the massive vaccine program and a number of the things that they were working on. You could say with the lockdowns, et cetera, that they had accomplished quite a bit for their own side by moving $2 trillion to the top and having companies like Amazon benefit so much from that. But they wanted to go further. They wanted to be institutionalized, and this is where they made their mistake. So the question is, where's this mistake gone to lay? You can't just maintain this weird position that nobody wants, except for a small group that you've brainwashed on the Democratic side. That's not going to fly. So what do? I mean, in 1974, President Nixon fired the special prosecutor looking into Watergate. Shortly after that, he was out of office. These are the moves. When you get up at that level, you just keep going. And we see Biden going into that. When they asked him, what are you going to do different this year after all the failures last year? He said, nothing. I'm going to basically double down on what I've been doing. So, they're headed for a crash. And the question is, is it going to be like Berlin after World War II? We're going to have to walk around with shovels digging out the rubble. It could very well be. They're throwing a wild Hail Mary with this war with Russia idea. And this gets us into a whole different discussion that brings in a topic that's very near and dear to the show here, which is the hot zone. So we're going to get into that tonight as well. Fantastic group here with us. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'll try to grab a couple of questions at the end of the show. And of course, we'll get back to questions. We have X119 coming up next week, and this is a very important episode where we're going to be giving out some information that's going to tie a lot of things together we've been talking about and revealed for the first time some historical connections which are not hitherto talked about. Now, a lot of that gets us into the hot zone, and it gets us into this JFK-Hemingway connection, which is very important because of an intelligence group that they were both a part of there in the late 30s and early 40s, which doesn't receive any real notice except as something that was going on that the CIA later became upset about and the FBI tried to shut down. This is very interesting, and threads of it are in our episode, The Caroline Group, which we did in episode 116. And the one we just did, which is Ghislaine in the Hot Zone. And this is very important because the Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein piece has to be understood in a much larger context of geopolitics rather than, oh, weren't they perverted? Didn't they run all these orgies and all that stuff? They did. There's no question about that. But the scientific connections involved, the archaeological searches involved, the cult aspects involved. These are the pieces that are so crucial for us. And if we don't understand that side of it, we'll never get it. We'll just get that sensational headline. And we'll also find people like Maxwell being found guilty of human trafficking, but the people she was trafficking to getting off scot-free, a la Prince Andrew. So, we're looking at some very interesting things. And I know some people could say, well, with Prince Andrew, they stripped him of his military titles. I'm talking about a real legal case. So let's keep it all in perspective here tonight. So coming out here out of the gate, as we mentioned, there's this huge caravan in Canada. That situation, as it develops, sets off a series of worldwide dominoes. There's no question. So the moves that the establishment is going to make to shut that down are going to be very interesting, because they've been facing now huge, and I mean huge, protests worldwide. If you're in Europe, there's huge protests. If you're in Australia, huge protests just across the globe. So this is the piece of the operation that the deep state, they may have anticipated, but I think now the pushback is getting so dramatic on the ground that they've lost control of the narrative on that front. So they need now to come up with something to get them out of this fix. And I'm sure they have a number of contingency plans, just like, I heard the typical news story flashes about this Justice Breyer retirement, and how, Joe wants to make sure that he makes it a black woman for the Supreme Court. First of all, you're not supposed to be able to do that by sex or by race, right? We got rid of that a long time ago. So that was weird to start with, but also they knew going into this year that he was going to retire. So this was like, okay, retire when we get into trouble so we can change the narrative. So his retirement has been on the table, and Biden knew all about it. So the idea that they're huddling, really trying to figure this out, they already know who's going in fact. So all this stuff was worked out a long time ago, and we need to keep our wits about us when we deal with these types of stories, because whatever is going on in the media, the establishment is already years ahead. So we have to wonder, somewhere in their playbook, in the contingency plans, is that they would hit a real hard turn, and you'd have people who aren't even known for being that deep in the mainstream media, starting to question things. And you have this kind of diametric opposition between people who just want, on the liberal side, who want to be able to, go back to the way things are normally done, which is we express an opinion, and we do our stories. But those people are being chased even off Substack. And, the establishment is incredibly afraid of the conversation going forward. This is what we're looking at. So people who used to be in the kind of leftist mainstream, like Taibbi and Greenwald and people like this, they're now being attacked outright by liberal colleagues. And they're like, what's going on here? So the neocon bunch can move. It can move from party to party, from side to side, So George W. Bush, let's go into Iraq and invade, weapons of mass destruction, which weren't there. That's all the conservative side. And then you move that operation over to, we have a medical emergency, so therefore all your rights don't matter anymore. And guess what? We're in charge. But it's the same group, just using, and that's all liberal, because the conservatives have no interest in that, because the conservatives fundamentally understand that their bread and butter is the Constitution, because that's their following, that's their base. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalists X State of the Union. We're going to go deep here. There's three core places that we're going to go with this. Continuity of government, which is crucial for 2022. And this is a vast underground government network, sometimes referred to as the Doomsday Network. And I think most eloquently researched by Professor Peter Dale Scott. And the UFO file, as it stands in 2022, absolutely crucial because of the UFO threat narrative being launched by the Central Intelligence Agency. That's a crucial piece. And the two crucial figures, Avril Haines and Kristen Gillibrand, there, the senator from New York, who we covered recently in the UFO neocons, which is a phrase we need to get our hands on going forward to understand who's on the threat side and who's just doing research. And then the third piece is very hard because it requires an understanding of this show and the things we brought forward on the X series, but it can be easily opened up because so much of it is on the record, and that is land rising. Everyone say it together, land rising. This is an interesting one. So what's happening, and something that was predicted by the mystery schools many years ago, over a century ago, is that land would rise and that it would be new land and new nations as a result. The typical thinking around this is, oh, even if land rose, it would take thousands of years for it to become habitable. No, it's actually not true. And also with the weather manipulation that we have, we can make any climate that we want and speed up any process that we want. But this land rising is actually taking place. So as you hear people talking about, oh, oceans rising, we need to tax everybody because these oceans are rising. It's not actually true. In some places, you will see that that's happening, but it's part of a worldwide earth change. And the people who are driving so much of the madness that we see in culture are aware of these things, and they've always sort of ridiculed them and made them fringe subjects. And they've kept them out of the mainstream. If you go back to the 1959 book by Charles Hapgood dealing with the pole shift, you will find that the man giving the forward is Albert Einstein. Einstein understood very well that pole shifts and earth changes were possible and had happened previously, and supported Hapgood's work. And Hapgood was a major proponent of the Atlantis theory. So we have to look at that and really say, well, there's someone who's noted as the top scientist of our times. They're in the 20th century. What about that? Why is he doing the forward for Hapgood's book? It's because he understands that this is going to be a crucial piece moving forward. So that's kind of an X-share style move when you're up on these levels and you're sharing that information to move the culture forward. However, you will also find, as we've discussed on this program, X-Protect, which gets rid of that information and will apply all kinds of means to discredit it. That group operates in conjunction somewhere inside the Central Intelligence Agency in the aerospace corridor of the military-industrial complex. Those are things we've laid out on the show, and now they're so fundamental in 2022. I actually feel like so many of the themes that we've done on the show are just becoming the headlines, and we're going to see more of that. This one in particular, I think, is a little different because the UFO file, okay, people understand there's something going on with the UFO file, and now they're saying, oh, the New York Times is talking about it. So even if they didn't believe in it, they can see that. Atlantis rising, an ancient culture that was advanced, in our discovery of it in modern times, and then the discovery of the fact that there's been a group effort over the course of a century to bring this information and develop this information for certain groups inside the government is rather dramatic, actually. In some ways, our ancient past regarding Atlantis is more of a kind of a happening for humanity than the UFO file, which is something I think we've already kind of acknowledged. Okay. But a real sophisticated technological past for our culture, and then everything that we regarded as advanced, like the Egyptians and the Mayans, being legacy cultures from something much more advanced in mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and all these other things. That is something that rocks our own consciousness forward and rocks it awake. And these are the things that we need to watch for. Now, I'm going to start with that one tonight because it's understandably obscure, but not if you watch this show, because so many of the geopolitics in the hot zone area there down by the Bahamas and Cuba is driven by the understanding that there's land rising there and that there are ruins beneath. And that's something that we have a hot zone series inside the X series giving out that information. It's going to become very crucial. A couple of quick things to get to before I jump into land rising. We've been talking about this hippie conspiracy for a little while, and a lot of people have been talking about this, that Neil Young asking Spotify that he didn't want to be on there. And this is something that's happening with the corporate hippies. They make so much money and they start living in mansions and they forget that they were protesting the Vietnam War, and that's how anybody even knows who they are. But we have an interesting juxtaposition, I feel, between Bob Dylan, who is the kind of proto-ultimate hippie in a sense, and Neil Young. Neil Young is all, trust the pharmaceutical companies and all the rest. And so you have Joe Rogan's show goes out there and talks about this, and some of the, really cashes in on some of the narratives that are going on out there. And like Dr. Malone bringing forward incredible information about the safety around these things. So we're seeing this happen. And, you have someone like Rogan realizing the zeitgeist and bringing those people in. But then you have people like Neil Young, who are also on Spotify, saying, I won't be there if he is. By the way, Barry Manilow his name was getting thrown under the bus left and right as being part of this Neil Young movement. But he came out just before the show started tonight, and he said, this one's for you. I have nothing to do, and I never said anything about taking my music off of Spotify because of these shows or whatever. So, just take Barry Manilow out of there. Somebody threw that in there to add momentum. It's just complete junk conspiracy. But hippies for censorship, this is important because there's something going on back there. I've said before that it's my feeling that there are groups that are consolidating the hippie culture from the 60s because they really fear something in there, this kind of quest for freedom inside of it. Whether or not it had excesses or whether or not you had hangers-on or people who are just opportunists inside of it. If you look at the 60s, fundamentally, you're going to see something, which is there is a freedom spirit involved. There's a movie called My Dinner with Andre from the early 80s, and this big psychological conversation these two guys have. But Andre, the character, says, well, I think we're going to look back and see that the 1960s were the last burst of humanity before he went extinct. Before, humanity forgot its role as a creative force. This is so important a realization. And I feel that they're trying to bottle up the 60s, which is very important. When I look back on it, it's eras back there, but I can see, when I talk to people who grew up in that era, I'm getting so much feedback from them about what it was like. And this is something that the World Economic Foundation crowd, the Gates people and all the rest, they cannot stand this sense of freedom that people had in that period and the overlap from it. So I believe what's happening is they kind of want to make it a museum piece and spin it their own way. So you see this vast consolidation of music rights around this. So they recently did this with Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan, during the lockdowns and everything, came out with a 17-minute song about the JFK assassination, which is still a real extreme sore spot inside the deep state because they're still kind of hung out to dry over it. Their guilt is still very obvious. And this is kind of like, something that's just understood in culture, whether or not the history books pick up on it. Everyone kind of knows that the Central Intelligence Agency assassinated President Kennedy. So it goes to their credibility over and over again. And the CIA, which runs so much now, has their own Air Force, has that influence on media, has their influence on politics. They've become such a force and such a driving force in the deep state that we're looking at largely a CIA world. Even this whole thing that's going on in the Ukraine, look, in Ukraine, they have this president out there, and he comes forward and he says, I had this conversation with Joe Biden, and don't tell me what's going on. I'm here. I know what's going on. What are you people up to? And we're supposed to be allies. So, they are ginning up this because they need that ability to bring Russia to its knees because it's not going along with this program. Russia has its own problems and it has its own, domination aspects. And when they were, running the Soviet Union and all the rest, their human rights record was nothing to write home about, of course. But nonetheless, the idea of having war with Russia is absurd. First of all, it's a nuclear power. And second of all, there's no reason to be encircling it with a number of military bases under the idea of NATO. Yeah, it's a very old, this would be something that would happen after World War II or something. So it's too much of a resources grab that we're seeing there. So I think both sides need to really seriously work out the next steps. But this big neocon push coming in through the Democratic side is ridiculous. First of all, the Democrats classically, as classic liberals, were supposed to be anti-war. This gets back to the hippie thing, which is they didn't want the Vietnam War, and it brought the country to a standstill, and they had massive protests and all the rest of it. Now you have guys like Neil Young saying, big pharma's great. So what happened there? What's the disconnect? Well, let's go back to the Dylan piece, because Dylan doesn't. And Dylan is coming out with a new tour, and I find this absolutely fascinating. I still can't get over this. This is the poster for Dylan's new tour. And if you take a look, you're going to see this strange skeleton creature holding a needle. That's where Dylan's at. He's not taking a Neil Young position that Big Pharma's great. He's saying, we got some problems here. Rough and rowdy ways, the worldwide tour, things aren't what they were. That's Dylan's message. And, recently they sort of came forward with some charges out of nowhere about Dylan from 1965. Think about that. And it was a case where it's basically a rape charge from back then. And here we are 57 years later. And they came up with this. You have to wonder about the timing on that. So the hippie conspiracy is on. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X State of the Union. We are going through the UFO file, continuity of government, CERN, and land rising piece of what we're laying out for 2022. This is kind of a vision ahead, along with the fall of figures like Trudeau and Stepford Biden. What is that going to mean when these guys unravel? What if Fauci goes to prison? What's going to be the impact? What are the ripples around that? Well, that set off a series of trials in relation to this. Now, right now, the establishment has no appetite for that. But as this thing gets closer, are they going to want to start throwing some of these people to the wolves? Could very well be. The Trudeau case is going to tell us a lot. I do feel something to be aware of in all this is people like Johnson. Boris Johnson in the UK is another one who came in as a conservative, freedom-loving and all this stuff, and then turned on a dime and became a fascist mandate pusher to the shock of all of his supporters. But now the media in the UK has him partying during these lockdowns, and this is something where he's going to be kind of put out to pasture. So the way that they do this is very interesting, because I'm reminded again and again by people who operate and research in that world of the Central Intelligence Agency that the Central Intelligence Agency actually has contempt for people who play along with their narratives. This is quite fascinating. They may despise their enemies, but they tend to respect them if they have actual values. If they know that this person has gone along with them, although they're satisfied, and they give them all these rewards, they have a silent contempt for them, and eventually they will throw them by the wayside. We've seen it over and over again. There's no loyalty to it. In fact, some of the first things that they were doing with the people who were really into mandates and all the rest of it was, when they changed all the status of these people from, being fully injected and all the rest. Suddenly they needed 3 in order to have that status anymore. That's the kind of contempt thing, which is, you went along with us and that's good, but here's, as a result of that, you're our slave now. And they do a lot of this. The Andrew Cuomo case is very interesting because they disposed of Cuomo in a way where they said, we're going to get you to step down, and here's how we're going to do it. We'll do it with the sex scandal, which is basically nothing and everyone expects it, you grabbing somebody's behind while you're in the governor's mansion, that's one thing. However, all those people you killed in the nursing home, that's very different. And you can go to prison for a long time. So will you step down now, or do you want to go to prison? So that's a pretty easy game that they play with these guys. And the Cuomo gang basically gets away with it. And then a year and a half goes by and they write like a best-selling book for $20 million, you know? So that's the way that this game rolls. But the Central Intelligence Agency will dispose of these people. The deep state does not, you know, unless that person can do something for them. If they start to develop into a liability, like Trudeau right now, they will throw Trudeau to the wolves, make no mistake about it. They will make them the scapegoat. And they've already shown hints of it with him, with things like racist statements in the past. You know, they love this. Everything is a racist statement, right? But this is what happens, which is you join into this program and this kind of woke mentality idea, and eventually they turn it on you. They find something, you know, oh, when you were 16 in high school, you know, you used the wrong word, and that's it. You're out. You're canceled, right? So that's deep state central in terms of the psychological warfare tactics that they use. And they always keep you, regardless of how much you're working for them and working with them, they always keep you in that state of like, we might, you know, with the control files, we might drop the bomb. So, okay, so we know there's a big gang out there, and a lot of them are very, very heavily compromised politicians. We've seen them, you know, we have this absurd mayor right now, Mayor Wu in Boston, I won't even get into. But against, you know, all the trends that are going on, she's requiring a vaccine for you to go in and buy a sandwich. So thank God in lovely Cambridge, we don't have that problem, because Mayor Wu's edicts don't reach out even this far. But you can see this kind of mentality. They're still trying to chin this thing up. They want it. This is what they want for the future. They want the smart city control. They want the fascist control. And they think if they control enough of the big cities and the resources around the big cities, they can get it. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist, X State of the Union, Land Rising, I said earlier. This is where we're going next. Okay, here's the contention. There's land rising, and there are groups inside the government and in secret societies that are aware of these things. And there's a large-scale geopolitical action to respond to it as it happens. That's one. Two, it carries with it some of the biggest names throughout history, including people like Ernest Hemingway, all the way up to, you know, who gave us such wonderful, incredible novels, all the way up to, you know, real scumbags like Jeffrey Epstein, who are also on this train, but coming from two different tracks. The idea of land rising comes directly out of mystery school research. In anthroposophy, they talk about there's land rising. The Edgar Cayce readings get very specific, even predicting when it started. And turns out through those predictions of Cayce, we got to see this. The implications of land rising: one, if that land rises in international waters, no one can claim it, so it is in fact a new nation. We're going to see that this is going to become a big factor, and the world changes, earth changes aspect of lands sinking and lands rising is going to be a major theme into the 21st century. The groups that are running a lot of the ops around the global dictatorship are very aware of this. The World Economic Forum, I guarantee you, it's at the very top of these agendas, controlling that population and planning for the consolidation when these land mass moves happen. Now, people study it, and they study crustal displacement. We've had excellent people look at this in the past. Hapgood, of course, is crucial on this. Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, just an incredible group of people looking at these things. And that really backs up and supports the things that have been coming forward through people like Cayce and Rudolf Steiner, for example. So let's take a look at some concrete examples of this. So it's not just, you know, isn't that an interesting idea? There are, throughout the science journals, all kinds of examples of this happening now over the course of the last 5 years. And they're trying to normalize it in language. But if you look before 2016, it's almost non-existent in terms of them reporting on it. But they're doing very much what they started to do with the UFO file before they started trotting out CIA people like Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon, defense intelligence guy, to promote this. Now, the land rising piece has a kind of a similar problem, which is they have a need to normalize it because it's going to start to happen and people are just going to start to see it. So then what do you do? So here's a science journal, Nature News. Land rising by Astja volcano. No signs of imminent eruption. Land rising. Let's just get into this. The land by the Astja volcano in central Iceland is rising at a rate of 5 centimeters per month, according to the Iceland Meteorological Office. This is likely due to new magma flowing towards the surface. Such an event can end in a volcanic eruption, but it's also possible that magma cools and hardens without ever reaching the surface. So during the course of this, we realize as we get around volcanic activity, there is really a strong indication that this is what's driving so much of the land rising. Interestingly enough, Casey in his reading said that there were actual undetected volcanoes beneath the island of Bimini, and this is probably part of what's pushing up the landmass there. And I'm going to get deep into what he had to say about it too. More on this article. Okay, this one has to do, this is actually a different case. That was Iceland. This is Sweden. Let me see if I can find the headline on this one. All right. Land rise itself is creating a more shallow port, said Henrik Vorjon, the managing director of the port of Luleå. He describes how the port, which was built in the mid-70s, is getting too shallow for the larger ships that are coming into the port nowadays. During these last 40 years, the land has risen by approximately half a meter due to the post-glacial rebound. Not the seas have risen, the waters have risen, the land is rising. This is why the town of Luleå is working on a project to deepen its port so that bigger ships will be able to freight goods there. They actually have to compensate from this. So it's on record. So if someone says to you, oh, land doesn't rise, whatever, there are already scientific studies, there are already towns and ports that are coping with this as a result. Here's a video now in India that went around and became viral in the fall. In the video, an area that is submerged underwater suddenly starts rising. I've seen this video, and it is remarkable. The land just rises directly out of the water, and then it's there. The person recording the video is heard asking people to stand back as the land continues to rise. This is on the ground recording, and this is the kind of things that you don't hear about, and that they're slowly but surely getting the word out about now. But land rising is absolutely crucial if we're going to understand the geopolitics that are going on in the hot zone. Because if you're just looking at it from a political vantage view, it's not going to make really any sense. That Cuba, during all this time of the last century, has been such a hot, topic, just a political football for a decade, for a century. WHOI scientists and engineers explore lost city in the Atlantic. This is what we're seeing. These are scientific journals starting to grudgingly acknowledge what Edgar Casey is talking about. There's land rising in the Bahamas. In Casey's terminology, in his cosmology, it's connected with an advanced culture out of Atlantis. Scientifically, though, now it's rising. And when it rises, we're going to see some of those remains. But the remains are so advanced that they don't make sense with our current story of human history, because all the Bahamas waters there, anything that's under there has been under at least 12,000 years, more likely 50. So how do you get entire Mayan landscapes or Egyptian landscapes when this place, would have been active 12,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago? You'd have to change and rewrite history entirely. Well, they haven't been willing to do that, but they've been privately pursuing the matter. And that's really what we're looking at in relation to this. Now, this one I want to really say comes directly from the work of that we do here in the X series, because here is Grunge, which is a magazine that is kind of like Vice or that style, BuzzFeed style. And here they talk about New Atlantis, the crazy true story of the micronation. Well, you know who founded New Atlantis, the micronation? Les Hemingway, the brother of Ernest Hemingway. And do they go into the whole thing point by point by point? And I'm telling you, this guy watched the Hot Zone series because he picks out things directly from it. But not so much to kind of pat ourselves on the back. The point is that this stuff is starting to come out to a wider audience. And this is what I say in relation to what we were talking about on the UFO file. The reason that I've objected to the way that the people in the UFO field have given carte blanche to the CIA on the narrative in order to get in the media and have TV shows and stuff like that is not because that's a sellout thing to do. Big deal. You see sellouts in all different types of fields. It's that people coming into the subject should not be fed the CIA narrative as kind of their first blush on the UFO topic. And so we see that now through Avi Loeb, who himself is a veteran of 10 years of Talpiot, which is, Israeli version of the CIA. You've got all CIA people that he's recruiting now. Before it was all scientists for the Galileo project. So it's very important that we get the straight track on this, that, in terms of land rising, we get it directly from the mystery school work and work it out from there, not some weird CIA narrative. And if you were to say, well, why would the CIA care about this? I've pointed this out before. The CIA planted operatives inside the Casey Foundation, the Edgar Casey Foundation, to find out information about the Atlantean Hall of Records. Are these guys interested in this topic in order to spin it? You bet. They're interested in it for a deeper reason, which is the archaeology wars. That's something that goes on because the power of that knowledge or the power of a sacred object is much deeper than anything that they'd be willing to admit on the surface. When you think about the incredible events and people lining up to, touch the cloth that a saint put up in the 19th century or something like that and receive healing from it. Or, when we think about the different things with these dead saints whose bodies stay in the same exact state and people visit it from all around, like Saint Bernadette and the incredible visions she had there in the French grotto. There's power in these things, and there's power in these objects. So when you get a sacred object, it magnifies it dramatically. In the case of the Atlantean relics, it's Poseidian sacred pieces, and particularly the Two-Eye Stone, which was a power station that Casey had described, which ran the entire place and was installed around the globe. So this is a very advanced culture using the same type of advanced technology that we rediscovered in the 20th century, and largely using it for spiritual purposes when they first discovered it, and then later through a Belial group inside this group, creating a whole different type of structure for domination, much like what we're seeing now. But you're going to find when we look at things having to do with things like the Epstein, human trafficking, and Ghislaine Maxwell, that there's a thread there, and that thread is the Belial cult, that they're going into that Atlantean knowledge as a way to kind of reanimate that version of Atlantis and to become that Belial force group again. Now that requires, a lot of exposition that we don't have time for in this special report, but I will say that coming up, that cult of Belial is, and the way that it relates to so many of the things that we see, and there's very unusual connections with figures like Epstein and Maxwell, are going to really be made clear here over the next couple of episodes. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist special State of the Union. This is the X State of the Union, and it's great to have so many of you here with us. We've been hearing all these stories, of course, about this incredible caravan convoy of truckers heading directly to Ottawa, challenging all the mandates of Justin Trudeau and the really absurd kind of fascist rules they've been putting in place in Canada. For our friends in Canada, I hope that this goes in a very good direction and that they are successful. But it's going to be interesting, and it's a test case, really, when you think about it in relation to what we're seeing in the incredible pushback that they're getting But when we look at a place like Australia, which I've brought forward on this show as an international crisis, with the way those people are being treated and the rights that are just being eroded, and these democracies just being, thrown out with these really incredibly Goebbels like, leaders coming up to the microphones and saying the most absurd things. Well, I think every country in the UN really should look at Australia as an international crisis and really devise a way to get those people into a totally different situation and remove so much of that. Now, you do see a lot of the mandates falling in countries like the UK. We've seen them throw it out in Scotland. And Boris threw it out there in the UK recently as a last-ditch effort to throw a Hail Mary pass to save his position. But I think this is a very important move. Denmark is another one. And I think that Mr. Global there, the main force of that deep state, buried deep inside that Davos structure, they're starting to look around the world and saying, we need a new drug. We need a new way to handle this, because the groups that are continuing to push on in the old way that they were getting away with a year ago are really running into stiff opposition as more and more of the ethical medical community stands up. And that's a huge standoff when we get there. And hopefully it's a standoff, where we don't have to fire a shot. But I don't know what's going to happen. I will say this, that the deep state has overplayed their hand with so much of this, and they have more up their sleeve. They have this new thing now where they're calling Neo. And Neo's supposed to be like, it's the cool new disease, right? They've got a cool name from the Matrix movies. And if you get your treatment, your medicine for Neo, hey, it makes you hipster and cool. So they've really played this out to the edge. And sometimes when you play things out to an edge, somebody whispered in their ear, I'm sure, the Klaus Schwab types, that shock and awe would be the way to go on this. And they did accomplish a great deal. But this was also in the minds of the Nazis when they attacked both Russia and Britain. And what happens is you tend to, in your greed to have everything wrapped up and call yourself a military genius, you run the tendency to really overextend yourself and to open yourself up to contingencies that you didn't plan for. And I think that's what we're seeing in relation to this. Now, they have very smart people working round the clock in terms of doing damage control and all the rest. But nonetheless, think of something just as simple as Let's Go Brandon. They were not able to shut this down. And that's because it comes from a very spontaneous place inside the human psyche and the human spirit. And there's no AI that can beat that. It's just not possible. All you can do is overlay and overlay, but it gets very uncreative and stagnant and transparent when you do that. So these guys are in trouble with their op, but they've moved so much of the money up to the top at this point that they probably consider themselves enormously victorious. And they have been. However, the repercussions of that narrative falling apart, the cracks that we're already seeing in the government narrative, and the fact that the emergency aspect is the thing that they really were testing out here, which has been on the books for a while, goes all the way back to Hoover during the Second World War. I'm going to read that tonight because our next piece now, we've sort of touched on the land rising. There's more to touch on there. But the next piece that I want to get into is all about the continuity of government program and how this relates to the UFO threat idea. Now, I've said this a number of times on this program, which is if you thought that the COVID op was something, just wait till the UFO threat op comes to town. Because with the UFO threat op, all hands are on, everything's off the table because it's completely unknown. They have all the scare tactics in the world. They've been working with crashed UFO material for 70, 80 years at least, probably going back more, probably 1920s. So more like 100 years. And in the mystery schools, a lot longer than that. So the ability for them to reanimate this stuff and to stage an alien invasion really is quite high. Those odds would be extremely high. And they show indications just by the mere fact that they want to talk about the subject, which they used to find completely anathema. They would keep it out of the discussion completely, and they would ridicule anyone who brought it up, although they would use it as this kind of entertainment factor. So the fact that the CIA came out with all these CIA people and they created TTSA and rolled out Lou Elizondo pretending he was a whistleblower is very significant, because it's a major move on their part to see, can we feel the public out? Is there some fear factor for a UFO threat? Could we take over global control using this UFO threat? Would they surrender constitutional authority to us for an emergency? So emergency, emergency, emergency. This is the crucial aspect. Continuity of government. Emergency. September 11th, the emergency that gets signed onto in every NDAA going forward. This is where we are. And the National Defense Authorization for this year included a UFO UAP office. And it was put in there as a rider by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, who we profiled 2 shows ago. Something interesting, I think, in relation to her that I don't want to miss is that Gillibrand has deep connections to the aerospace industry through her family. And that has to be absolutely investigated. And also, I think is very important for someone running an office that deals with UFOs, especially someone who pumps up the threat aspect. And so I call those people UFO neocons. And certainly Gillibrand speaks in a very kind of saber-rattling way around this. One of the things I want to make clear is that Gillibrand also, in her family, has all these ties to the Nexium cult. And as a result of that, may be very easy to blackmail. The other powerhouse that she works with is a Republican, interestingly enough, Marco Rubio, senator in the hot zone. And Rubio, known as a real hardcore neocon who wants to bomb Iran and fun things like that. Well, here he is working with this Democrat trying to get a UFO threat going. So what's going on there? Well, oddly enough, Rubio is another one that you look at and you say, well, he's infinitely got this kind of blackmail trail to him through these strange stories we've heard over the years about his private life. So I find it very interesting, and the first thing that I look at through this kind of CIA lens is Gillibrand and Rubio are very, very blackmailable, and that's something we need to keep an eye on going forward. Let's talk about the 509th Bomb Group. Remember this guy? That's the guy who found the Roswell wreckage after it was reported to him by a rancher. And he was one of the top intelligence people in the country at the time, and his group, the 509th, was the only group that was allowed to drop the atomic bomb. So that's about as high end as you get. And they were stationed there in Roswell. So Jesse Marcel's story was that he found all of these strange things on this Mac Brazel's ranch after hearing all these reports about a UFO crash. And he went out there and checked it out. And it took a long time to get out there to where it was. You know, we talk about the Roswell case as if it was around the corner in Roswell, but it was way, way out. And Roswell was just the closest kind of big city in relation to all this. Now, when we look at his story, what we see is that they instantly had him cover up the evidence by saying it was a weather balloon. And he came out 30 years later, not at the time, 30 years later, which I think gives a lot of heft to that story, and said, no, they made me cover it up, but what we found was something that was clearly not from this world. I'd never seen anything like it. It had hieroglyphs on it. It was advanced. The metal itself wouldn't bend or burn. There was nothing you could do with it. They didn't know what it was. So it's very clear that whatever crashed there was nothing that we knew in our intelligence programs, because he would have known, having been very deep in those intelligence programs. So that whole case takes on a gravity, and then years later, it's pumped out and really drained and marketed, and every kind of circus sideshow or TV show gets involved with the Roswell case. But fundamentally, for our purposes, what we have is a very high-ranking official coming forward and saying, this really happened, and they maybe lie about it at the time. That's very significant. But the bomber group that he was a part of was the 509th Bomber Group. Now, after the September 11th attacks, George W. Bush created something called NORTHCOM in 2002. And NORTHCOM was set up to run the United States in the case of an emergency. So the continuity of government players turned over their authority to the NORTHCOM commander. Now, there have been a few commanders, including some women, on this, and I've covered some of the men, including Terence O'Shaughnessy, who retired rather early. And they installed this man, General Van Herk. He's the NORTHCOM commander. This is the guy who would be the combatant commander of the United States if the continuity of government charter were invoked. And the way that it stands now with continuity of government is that charter can be invoked for any emergency. Originally, of course, it was just for nuclear emergencies, but they changed that. And the people who were involved with changing it were very familiar faces on the deep state side, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Interestingly enough, neither were really in a significant position in government at the time, which is kind of strange too, how they got called in to kind of create this structure the second time around. Van Herk is from the 509th Bomb Group, the same exact group as Jesse Marcel. That's very significant to me because I feel that Van Herk's role and something that they want to create is that whole alien invasion emergency scenario, and then you would have Van Herk in that emergency powers seat. Now, somebody who would say, well, that's pretty far out, or it's paranoid or whatever, look at what we've been dealing with. I mean, they've been building this up for a long time. There's actually a very consistent thread in this for anyone who wants to study it on the deep state side. Here's the funny thing that I've noticed, and I've pointed this out, which is you've got these mentalities going into this. Some of them deal with, UFO issues, and they understand the UFO issue very well, but they don't understand the deep state side, and they don't understand what the government is capable of. Sure, they like to yell cover up once in a while, but they don't have that depth that you get from assassination researchers or those who've looked into the JFK case. I remember my deep conversations with Jim Mars, for example, and he was someone who could do both. He understood how both interrelated. That's somebody who understood that full picture. Stan Friedman was another one who understood both the UFO file and the deep state. But unfortunately, with the flunkies that they throw out there, the circus guys, the entertainment guys, Corbell and things like that, those are just for shows. They don't have any depth knowledge about the government. They just like to yell about it. So in the UFO field, you have an incredible missing link, which is they don't have the deep state understanding. They don't have that grasp of how the government actually works and compartmentalizes. And then on the deep state side, you have incredible knowledge. The people who studied the Kennedy assassinations, for example, or the drug running of the Contras, whatever it happened to be, they understand how the government works very well. They understand overthrowing of governments. They understand assassinations. They understand how the CIA works. But they aren't interested in the UFO file because you've got so much of a circus in the way that the UFO file is laid out. So what you have is one group that needs to kind of up its game significantly and also get rid of all the CIA players. And that is the UFO field. Get rid of like Nick Pope and Elizondo and all that. It doesn't mean anything. And bring forward real core researchers, bring forward people who've had experiences, bring forward the good witnesses. That way you can develop a whole entire track, along this line of getting to the point, getting to the truth of the whole matter. The problem is the deep state people aren't going to do that. And they're the ones who have the knowledge about how the government works on the cover-up side. So the UFO people, end up being the tools or the puppets for the CIA. And the CIA comes in once in a while and says, hey, we have this great thing. We're going to share it with you. You're finally going to get that disclosure that you want. And they run around after them thinking, I'll get on a TV show. So you have that. And unfortunately, it creates a kind of a sick environment on the UFO side. How you get out of that is for those researchers on the UFO side to have some, like I wish they could take like a 1-year course in deep state CIA, matters, because what happens is they don't have that background. And so the CIA is able to go in there and play them every time. And then, and you have, Air Force intelligence guys like Rook Doty and all that whole thing. And they come out in that world, and the UFO shows interview them like they're going to get the truth out of guys like that, so it just doesn't show, they're not thinking rationally about it. I think that we can learn a great deal from people like Doty, just in terms of how the disinformation is laid out. But I don't expect them to tell us the truth on these things. It's just not part of their, counterintelligence is the art of lying to confuse the enemy. And if you're the government, the enemy are the honest citizens on the ground looking for the truth about UFOs, because you don't want to share that, especially if you're the CIA. And I'm very fond of saying, in relation to the CIA, the idea of going to the CIA for the truth is like going to the KKK for a togetherness rally with, NAACP. It just doesn't, there's no logic to it. And the Central Intelligence Agency has lied at an official level, never mind sub-official levels, or on a press level, to people asking them questions. So the idea that we, all of these major news outlets are dealing with all CIA people pretending, oh, that damn government better give us the truth. It's a very embarrassing, absurd situation, because they are the government. They've had access to all that stuff. And now they have themselves in this role with the help of the mainstream media, people like Brennan, the drone king under Obama, the CIA director, who's really one of the biggest swamp creatures in the deep state. He can come out and say, oh, I'm all for UFO disclosure, and guys like Elizondo used to work for him. So you can see it gets very deep there on the UFO side. But he has a kind of a double fate here. He's COG and UFO. So let's talk about the continuity of government side for a moment. I actually have some quotes here from Professor Peter Dale Scott, and I always like to kind of ground the conversation in Scott's work, because I think fundamentally Professor Scott brought forward that understanding about Northcom and gave us, this piece that we need to understand, which is, ever since the 2001 attacks, every year the president signs on to the COG September 11th emergency powers. Doesn't matter if he's Obama, Trump, Bush, whoever, they all sign on to it in order to get that $800 billion, almost $1 trillion from the NDAA. If they don't sign it, then the 800 billion never comes through. And so they're obligated to. But what it does is it puts us under that COG wing. The COG control is completely unconstitutional. It has no place in the Constitution. And it is the most absurd thing to just hand over to a bunch of military bureaucrats the ability to run the world, because they have the ability to say, this is an emergency. We've seen emergency powers activated, and we've seen the kind of lawlessness and the kind of disrespect for the Constitution that took place as a result during the lockdowns. You can't go to church. Remember that one? You can't go to school. You have to wear a mask. All these different things. Violating so many different levels of that Constitution. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Just absurd. And beyond absurd. But the only reason they were able to do it was what? It's an emergency. So when I have something that I can call an emergency, on the back of that, I can piggyback an operation. And that operation can be total control. And you are under the impression, oh, they're dealing, with this emergency. What can you do? Well, in fact, the emergency is one thing. Just like during the terrorist thing, you might remember Tom Ridge, the head of Homeland Security, created that system. And it was a different system. And if you got to a certain point, you were at terrorism high alert, and they were able to, create things like the TSA and all that. That's a pretty significant step. But if you look at the arc of history of them taking powers, you can see one step at a time they're doing it. And we see these different coups d'etats over time. There's the financial coup d'etat in 2008, where they basically came to the US government and said, unless you want to call martial law, you have to give us all this money through the Fed. During the September 11th attacks, you have to give us the ability to attack Iraq, even though they had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, which were all supposedly by bin Laden, but that doesn't make any sense either. That air defense structure had been put in place a long time ago to fight an actual nuclear enemy, the Soviet Union. There's no way that you could get through air defenses like that with 19 guys who didn't have any weapons except box cutters and a controller in a cave in Afghanistan. It doesn't make any sense. So all of those things don't add up, but we've rolled along ever since, coup after coup. And now we have the pharma coup. Those things all ride on one thing: emergency powers. Emergency powers created something called the Enabling Act, which gave you Adolf Hitler in the first place back in 1933. So, the ability for countries and groups to launch false flags, to create circumstances where you need to call an emergency and consolidate the power into yourself. If you look at the Enabling Act, it gave Hitler all kinds of abilities which weren't anywhere in the German Constitution at all. And this is how they're able to do it. And it's the same mechanism over and over again. This thing is run completely on emergency powers. Now, during the first wave of COVID in 2020, during the election, President Trump got COVID. And suddenly there were two things going on in this period in October when they thought Trump was pretty much unbeatable on the ground, especially when they had Stepford Biden out there and he could only go to like a drive-in theater and attract like 20 people or something. They thought, well, we have to do one or two things. We're going to have to engineer this election, or we're going to have to find a way to get this guy out through other means. And there's no question that when he got COVID, they instantly started talking about continuity of government, which is a very rare subject to see in headlines. As a matter of fact, I've pointed out before that in congressional testimony, at a certain period in time, you were not even allowed to mention COG. That's how secret it was. And the idea was national security. So I've pointed out that the continuity of government program is the same set of rules that gives us an underground government to call the shots and be ready in case an emergency happens or another country tries to attack us on a nuclear front. But those, the limitations of that is that the managing of that thing becomes so secret that you can apply any kind of rationale in any kind of program and money starts to disappear through a secret system of finance. Then we start to hear about, in the space program from 1972 to the present, that's 50 years, no manned missions to the moon. It's quite extraordinary. So what do you do for 50 years in space with no manned program? Obviously, there was some program that was going forward. So the continuity of government question gets us into not only questions about an underground government and secret system of finance and suspension of the Constitution enshrined in these obscure rules, but it also flips around and gives us that same secrecy in space. So we find ourselves looking at a very, very interesting set of circumstances, and we start to understand it is through these rules that we find ourselves in this present situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special State of the Union. Here we are at the end of January, when traditionally the State of the Union is done, but Stepford Biden doesn't have any interest, so I'm taking over and giving you the real deal. we're going to have some very, very important shows coming up for you in February. And I'm thinking of calling February the month of the hot zone, because the revelations are going to come hard and heavy on this. And some of the things that I think that we've uncovered for you are going to be shocking. I want to mention just an outline here of a couple of quick ones, and then I'm going to read some of Professor Scott's quotes around Northcom. It's no surprise to anyone on this show that we've tied in to historical figures through a number of different threads, and that is Ernest Hemingway and President Kennedy. On the record, there are letters sent by Senator Kennedy's office asking Hemingway some questions about his books, but that's about it. In fact, I'm going to show, and we have shown in this program, these very deep connections that these two had over a series of time. I also want to point out that Hemingway, of course, his entire library of works, hang on just one second, I'm having some kind of camera wonderfulness going on here. Technical. Isn't that something? Hold everything. Bear with us. It still is Mercury retrograde, I am sure. Okay, there it is. I'm going to try to, there we go. All right, we're back. Whew. That's better. Okay, now the connection itself, there's actually letters found that never made any sense. These were found in JFK's dorm long after he left, which it's an actual letter to Hemingway in JFK's handwriting. And this is a letter which takes on the tone of a personal interaction. There's no question that they had a relationship. And everyone assumes, well, it must have been like an imaginary letter. You know, you write to like some famous celebrity and you're like, what would I write if I knew this guy? But that doesn't make any sense. And in my opinion, these letters are directly to Hemingway from JFK because they knew each other. And there's a couple of different figures who are the interconnecting links that really are going to make a lot of sense here. The actual letter on record that Kennedy sent to Hemingway was in July of 1955. And it says, "Dear Mr. Hemingway, I'm completing a book on political courage, the stories of senators who risked their careers speaking out for principles which are extremely unpopular among their constituents. I'm most anxious to use in the text a definition of courage as grace under pressure, which I recall was attributed to you." There's a lot of interesting things in there, and I think the letter is loaded as something that is technically on the record, but also contains some threads there. For example, Grace is the name of Hemingway's mother, and Hemingway's mother was the one with the very close connection with Edgar Cayce, and Edgar Cayce would give readings for Hemingway through the mother. That's on record, and you can find that at the Association for Research and Enlightenment. But the question is, this relationship of Hemingway with JFK is quite interesting because Mary Hemingway, after Hemingway's death, talked JFK into retrieving a vault on the island of Cuba that belonged to Hemingway. And we've done some episodes on this, of course, in the Hot Zone playlist series, so you can watch those. My point is that this whole thing about land rising is going to come into focus in the information that we bring forward relating to proof that JFK and Hemingway knew each other. The intermediary, the person who kept them off the record but was able to transfer messages back and forth. There's a very famous story of Kennedy using a Washington Post correspondent to go back and forth between Khrushchev in Russia, delivering hand delivering these messages directly from him. No State Department, no CIA, nothing. And the CIA got very, very concerned. What are these guys talking about? Are they talking about the UFO file, etc.? And they always try to maintain their own people whenever Kennedy met with Khrushchev, and later when Reagan met with Gorbachev. And those conversations would come out later. And in fact, they were discussing the UFO file. Of course, they did the same thing with Trump and Putin, trying to pretend if those two got together and were talking, it was collusion and all that. So many of those things are about the UFO file when we read into these things. The person in question who transferred the messages is William Walton. I'm going to give us all that much before I reveal things going forward here in February in the Hot Zone. They're going to blow the historical record to bits. William Walton was best friends with Hemingway, but also a close advisor of JFK. And this guy was able to be that kind of intermediary that Kennedy had used in different situations. Very interestingly, Jackie Kennedy had a close relationship with Hemingway's son, Patrick, and Patrick would oversee all of the different incredible library of material that's available at the JFK Library of Ernest Hemingway's material. Tell me how that makes sense. An incredible, vast amount of the JFK Library is taken up with Hemingway's papers. You have to learn how to read those connections and how those trends come about. But this is what it comes back to, which is there's an area there in the Hot Zone where if you work in that capacity, scanning the ocean floor, whether for the military or for private contractor companies, looking for minerals or whatever it happens to be, we've learned you need to sign on to these NDAs that say, if you run across ancient ruins, large buildings, large structures, you cannot come up from that submarine dive and say, hey, give me NBC on the phone. I just saw this huge ISIS pyramid under Bimini, and I need to talk to somebody about it right away. It's not allowed. So then you have to ask yourself the question, why not? Well, this is a large story with major threads, but those threads are really coming to the fore for 2022. And I'll tell you, the figures who are involved, some of the faces are very familiar, but you're going to see this guy involved. Oh, I have a lot of different pictures of him here. That is our friend Richard Branson, space tourism, Virgin Atlantic man. This guy is involved in and around Belize, and he is taking that aspect of the Hot Zone and searching deep and using it as a scientific front of looking for large blue sinkholes, which are fascinating phenomena in and of themselves. Now, this comes directly out of the Telegraph, and remember that one of the things we were connecting up last week was the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, who's the ultimate undersea guy who was searching for Atlantis. And she had become involved in this case by Virginia Giuffre against Epstein. And Epstein was pumping her for information. But for what? Why was he getting Cousteau close in there? They wanted the information on Atlantis there in the Hot Zone. What Richard Branson found in Belize's Great Blue Hole. We then tried to go through a thick hydrogen sulfide layer which had formed over centuries. It was extremely eerie. We didn't expect to see any creatures below, but when we got to the bottom, we could see other creatures that had fallen into the hole. And then he goes into this whole thing, but it's basically, he has the ultimate cover there, just like Terramar with Maxwell, for looking for artifacts in the Hot Zone without having to say, well, what are you doing down there? Why'd you spend $40 million in a sinkhole? So these are the types of things that if we understand them and bring them to the surface, then we're going to be looking at an entire different understanding around geopolitics in the area that they are dealing with an issue that is so sensitive. One, you're dealing with an ancient culture. Two, you're dealing with an ancient advanced culture. Three, you're dealing with the history of humanity. And four, you're dealing with a very strange power system that those people created, which is still a political football on the geopolitical front. So when you think about all these different groups involved, then you start to get a real picture of what was happening there. Without that picture, we don't understand what all these people are doing. We don't understand why Ghislaine has the cover of a Terramar Save the Oceans project. Sure, it's humanitarian, but why the oceans? Why the incredible emphasis in the hot zone? Doesn't really make sense. Cuba, even the Cuban Missile Crisis, honestly, does not really make sense. The idea that somebody would put the nuclear weapons inside of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, just as an intimidation factor when they had never done it before, still doesn't ring true. There's still something wrong with that story, in my opinion. Now, nonetheless, the negotiation of getting those missiles out of there without shooting off nuclear missiles is extraordinary. And the fact that Kennedy was able to do it meant that he saved the whole world. And he's a hero for doing that, regardless of anything else that happened to him, or the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency was able to get him out of the picture. He still was able to perform that incredible service for humanity, along with launching the space program. So that, legacy is there. But what I'm saying is Cuba's unusual. And we're going to find out just how unusual in the next couple of shows. And we're always involved in this. There's Cuban intelligence. There's the Bay of Pigs. There's Batista. And then there's Paulina Zalitsky, who finds in 2001 an entire ancient city off the western tip of Cuba. But before that, you have Thomas Townsend Brown hanging out in that same western tip of Cuba. What is it that's happening there, actually? Somebody mentioned Getmo in the chat. Exactly. Like, we've always maintained a peace there, even though we gave up the rest of it. So we needed that headquarters. What is AUTEC? I've never gotten a satisfactory answer for what is AUTEC. AUTEC is basically the underwater Area 51 right there off Andros Island. Well, what is Andros famous for? The Andros platform. What is that? Well, it's the Andros version of the Bimini Wall, an ancient artifact underwater. So these are the types of things that, as we come into 2022, we're not just looking at UFO disclosure. This piece around the ancient culture and the prophecies brought forward by the mystery schools, the work of Edgar Cayce, those predictions saying, what was it that Cayce said, talking about Bimini? He said, you're going to see those temples rising off Bimini. Expect the first parts in 68 or 69. And in 68 and 69, we got the Bimini Road. So that indication is there that this is the time for us to learn this and to learn that history. And if anything, we've been delayed because these things were rising through the 60s and the 70s. The Cayce work was getting out. The work that I've followed here, Dr. David Zink, Cousteau's work on Atlantis, everything gets derailed in the 80s. It all goes off course. Everybody seems to lose funding for those projects. So the next major thing that happens actually is Zalitsky finding this city off of Cuba. But that history is rising, just like the land is rising. And if we can get our consciousness wrapped around it, we're going to find ourselves in a very different place as far as understanding goes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew! This is the Dark Journalist X State of the Union, a fantastic crowd out there tonight. I'm going to try to get to at least a couple of your comments tonight, but we have some incredible X Series Hot Zone shows coming up here in February. I think we're going to call February the month of the Hot Zone because the revelations are going to be hard and heavy, I promise, and they are going to shake some things up in a major way. And next week is going to be the kickoff of that whole thing. And so we'll definitely have Olivia back to take your questions on that, but I'll grab a couple anyway tonight. Okay, let's see. Trudeau. Oh, yes. I mentioned that they don't like to have these guys around, the Russian president and the American president. They don't like those guys to hang out by themselves to talk about this. Well, here's one case, and this is the Smithsonian. Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to pause the Cold War in case of an alien invasion. That's on the record now. But think about it, and think about the idea of JFK being assassinated over the UFO file, we're starting to understand this piece of when they get up at that level, they're talking about the UFO file, and the general public doesn't get access to that knowledge. Now they're pretending that, hey, the CIA is creating this open window on the UFO file, and Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, is creating, along with Kirsten Gillibrand, whose dad was involved with the sex cult, and whose father-in-law is a big head of a British aerospace company, that these people are on a level playing field with the public. So this is a very tricky scenario to try to get any truth out of. But one thing that we know for sure, at least, is that the Central Intelligence Agency is not the place where you go to get this kind of information. And along that line, we have, of course, this incredible, along with the ASRO, which is that new UFO office, there's another one in there. And it's the Pentagon announces creation of UFO task force with unpronounceable name. It is a weird one. It's Anomaly Surveillance and Resolution Office is the easy one, ASRO, but the other one is AOI MSG. I just call it ANA, the annoying name anomaly. But there's a lot going on there. You've got the Space Force, you have the failed TTSA thing, which is trying to spin off CIA, Lou Elizondo, and Mellon. They're spinning off into that, and Mellon's providing, the money for that, and Lou is providing the BS and the whole character of a disgruntled whistleblower, which is always a lie. So what's going on there really? What are they trying to do? Some group is trying to take control of the public narrative of the UFO file. That group, in my opinion, is X-Protect, which has always been operative in that. But now they're trying to do it through traditional channels and to create a UFO threat operation as a result. That's the thing that we're in the middle of. That's why the UFO news is so weird. That's why Galileo Project is so weird, taking on CIA people. Doesn't make any sense. It's a scientific body. Galileo's, Avi Loeb's Galileo Project is maybe 5 or 6 minutes from here. Those guys, this is how they're moving that story forward. And I have to say that it's too bad, because we could use a genuine scientific body looking into these matters. I think guys like J. Allen Hynek really were. They had been through the phony Project Blue Book deal. And I think really what we were seeing is something totally different now, which is this is just a group prompted up by the CIA to create a UFO threat scenario. And we know in the case of Loeb, who's a Harvard scientist, that he is creating this idea that some of the objects drifting through the solar system, like Oumuamua, are AI. And if we can get our AI primed up in time, that they will give us secret messages, to help run the culture and save the planet from an environmental disaster. It's interesting. We're always getting saved from an environmental disaster, right? And then you always hear, this rhetoric, like we need to be saved from the environmental disaster. But then every corporate America sludge CEO guy, he gets to bail out with $1 billion parachute. Doesn't make any sense. These narratives don't make any sense. What would make sense if you had a genuine environmental crisis, which I believe that we do, in one sense, because the corporations have been, in fracking and everything else, have really destroyed certain parts of different forests and things like that. But they would be the ones on the hook for it. If they've got billions of dollars on their balance sheet, tap those guys for the money to clean up the environment. You wouldn't go after the citizens who, after all, were just buying things at inflated prices to start with. This is my kind of logic about it. I actually don't want to resist environmental stories. I want to learn about any environmental destruction that the corporations have, wrought upon the citizens of this. I think there's a natural kind of alienation from the alternative field when it comes to the environment, because they know, these guys talking about, like Al Gore trying to get carbon taxes for these types of things. those are fraudsters. Absolutely. However, I don't think we should have a knee-jerk reaction on the environment and the fact that the corporations have done terrible things to water. Look at stories like acid rain from the 80s, for heaven's sake. Nuclear testing, what did that do to the environment? So the governments and the corporations have misappropriated the environment, and they should repair it. And they're the ones who have the money to do it, not the citizens on the ground who you've destroyed their businesses through the great COVID lockdowns. So let's take that environmental piece and use it for the good of humanity by demanding the corporations do the cleanup. That makes sense to me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X State of the Union. Whew, we've gone through Stepford Biden, Trudeau, and the great trucker caravan heading his way. You can hear the convoy song in your head as we go. It's been terrific being here with you tonight, and I am just going to get to a couple more things, and then I'm going to wrap up, and we will, as I said, come back in February with those incredible episodes for you of the X series, and they are going to be mind-blowing. I also have some very special interviews coming up as well, and it's great to see so many of you out there with us tonight. I know that this weekend is a big deal, and that Canadian caravan is landing in Ottawa tomorrow. So we'll see what kind of a wild weekend that we all have in relation to that. You get that feeling kind of when they surrounded the Politburo there at the end of the Soviet Union. It's too bad that Yeltsin got installed, though, on that. Okay. Yes, a little more Hot Zone fun just to get us ready. A couple of quick things. I find headlines like this just fascinating considering the work that we're doing. But really, is the lost city of Atlantis revealing itself off the coast of the Bahamas? Just the fact that you can find these things now, I mean, yes. Yes, it is. But, we've moved into a stage where these are the things that we're going to be hearing about. And, of course, Casey is going to come up in relation to it. In Miami, Ernest's brother, Les Hemingway, founded a micronation, hosted seances, and hunted Nazis. That is from the Miami Times from June 2021. So they're getting on with the X series. They're getting into the micronation, New Atlantis, Les Hemingway. Now it's out there. This is the flag that Les Hemingway created for New Atlantis. Let that sink in. This is a guy with a lot of esoteric knowledge through his brother. Very interesting as this story unfolds, indeed. And, of course, his greeting card, Christmas greetings from New Atlantis. Our friend Les Hemingway, the lesser known of the Hemingways, but he was actually a proven author in his own right. And he wrote a book all about his brother, in fact, and he showed it to him. And Hemingway said, "This is a fantastic book. I love it. The only thing is, don't publish it until I'm dead." And in fact, he did. The thing that they were searching for, and I've pointed out the power of this, but the thing that they were searching for were Zalitsky's ruins off the western tip of Cuba. And Zalitsky got pushed out after discovering this. So whoever has their hands on these ruins now has been able to go in deep for 20 years and figure this out. Zalitsky was threatened, thrown in a Mexican prison at one point as an intimidation tactic, the scientists who discovered it. And her story is that of a heroine, really. She's quite heroic. But eventually what happened is she went back to Canada. What can you do? I mean, you can't take on the whole world. Cuban government, the Cuban Navy, and people are going to put you in prison in Mexico. I mean, you're going to back off. She's a scientist. She's an engineer. She's not a deep state warrior. So a quick thing about William Walton, who we're going to reveal on this program as the intermediary between JFK and Hemingway. This is a little teaser for what's coming up. When World War II broke out, Walton began working for Time magazine. Walton met journalist Mary Welsh while they both worked for the Times in England. Although he liked her and enjoyed her writing, he felt she lacked insight. Remember, Walton is a great confidant of JFK's. When Walton received permission to parachute into Normandy on D-Day, was training for the jump, Welsh invited him to a May 24th party at the London apartment of Robert Capa, a Hungarian war photographer. Capa had also invited Ernest Hemingway to the party. Although Welsh was not present, a mutual friend of hers introduced Walton to Hemingway. So D-Day, that's the period where they met, 1941. And although Welsh was not present, a mutual friend introduced her to Hemingway. Hemingway and Walton soon became good friends, in part because Hemingway was fascinated by Walton's forthcoming parachute jump. Walton parachuted into France, the 82nd, and Hemingway gained access to liberated France shortly thereafter. When Walton was staying in Cherbourg in mid-July, Hemingway visited him numerous times under the pretense of bringing him his mail. Hemingway and Walton also spent a week under the newly liberated Mont Saint-Michel in August 1944, drinking and eating as much as they could. Hemingway and Walton accompanied one another during the first phase of the Battle of Hurtgen Forest in September and October 1944. They even shared a double bed. This is how close these guys became. This person became the inside confidant for JFK, and JFK used him to get all kinds of intelligence through his different journalistic contacts. So Walton, we're going to discover, is the intermediary figure that links Hemingway with JFK, and we're going to go deep and dive into that early intelligence group where Thomas Townsend Brown shows up. So these are the things, the teasers that we're coming into on this, but I can guarantee you as I've been doing work on the Hot Zone episodes, this is the breakthrough piece that I've been looking for, the things that have come up and what we do with them and how they impact the culture. We're doing it like one person at a time. As you and I in the ideas room learn these things, it's like, different things are happening. And stories that seemed really far out 3 or 4 years ago when we were doing them here on the show, forget it, right? Trump and Nixon sounded like a weird fantasy or something, but they were that close, as we pointed out. And then in the last fall, the Nixon library released all that information about the close relationship between Trump and Nixon through the hundreds of letters that they shared together. But it was deeper. It was deeper than that. And I think that, this is part of the zeitgeist of the times. And this is what 2022 is going to be good for us, for all of us, because what we're seeing is a move into, we're getting just like the clash of reality into the Ottawa Power Center, dishing out all these mandates and taking the orders of Gates and Schwab and the World Economic Forum and that whole ilk, because it's not just them. But that's a pretty good place to get some of the faces and get some of the names and understand some of those connections. The deep state is much more clandestine in general. So when you see someone on the surface, for every person you see on the surface, there's 100 operating underground that you just have no idea about. But I think it's significant that as these things get out, as these truths hit the public, that we're going to be seeing a real awakening taking place. And the 3 pieces to watch, in my opinion, for 2022, again, the continuity of government emergency powers aspect and how that's used. I'm going to read the quote from Northcom before we leave here today. The UFO file and the spin of the UFO file into the UFO threat, even as they're developing a secondary AI scientific thing through the Galileo project over here. And then, so we've got the COG piece operating, we have the UFO file threat operating, and then finally the land rising is not going to be, they're not going to be able to block out the coverage of this type of thing. After a certain point, it's going to be like, what is going on here? We can see all kinds of things that we couldn't see before. There's too many people, and although they can very tightly control the media and what it sees, as we've seen the way they block stories. Look at the Hunter Biden laptop, everyone. I mean, this guy is really up to no good. Lip in the hood, up to no good. I'd have to say that in terms of the ocean rising aspect, through the information that we're bringing out, through the things that people are going to be seeing on the ground, this story around Atlantis ruins is not going to be able to hang out in that corridor much longer. And, we have Gigi Young out there tonight. Look at Gigi's work. I mean, this is something that just was not there in earnest in the way that it is now, say a decade ago. So we're at a different vantage point, and I think we can acknowledge that. And going into the full 2022, even with all the corruption challenges and all the government challenges and the things that we're up against, we're looking very much at the possibility of a major shakeout of information as we apply those pressures and resist censorship and call it out wherever we see it. Now, we're constantly censored in the work that we do. We see other people constantly censored. And we see, a lot of absurdity with people still identifying with right and left labels. And it's fine to be right or left. None of that actually counts. As long as you respect the Constitution, it's all good, because it's all there in the Constitution. And every official in the United States swears onto that Constitution. So we don't need to have those types of battles. I think those are the kinds of distracting things, just like, pro-vax and all that kind of stuff. It's not really where the conversation is at. They're driving that conversation. They had a committee meet at Bilderberg and draw that one up. The conversation is much deeper. It is, how can that group at the top continue to keep these things secret? X-Protect is all about secrecy. They've killed people over secrecy. They killed Morris Jessup over secrecy, not just because he was a respectable figure who understood the UFO file. This is the guy they killed in the late 50s. But because he had connected the whole Philadelphia experiment aspect to the UFO piece. That's X technology. That's the kind of thing that you find, they're in a no-win situation, because they don't want anyone to get at that. They don't mind if people talk about UFOs. But they don't want people to discover the X technology at the heart of the entire thing. That, I think, is a crucial piece that they're not willing to let go. And they are willing to release a certain amount of this UFO information as a pretext to create a threat. And that's the only place that level of disclosure is going, I promise you, from dealing with those people and from looking at their work in other areas. The intelligence groups behind the UFO push do not ever have the public interest in mind. They swear on to a belief system, which is there is no truth. Therefore, whenever they say anything, it's not a lie, because there is no truth. And that's where they're coming from. So we have to get ourselves, thinking like they think in order to understand them and see through them to the fears that are taking place there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. This is the X State of the Union. Whew, we have hit on COG, UFO, and of course, land rising in the hot zone. A couple of quick things about Northcom, because I think it's crucial, because it is Northcom that is the continuity of government peace. Continuity of government peace is directly related to this UFO file threat aspect. We have to keep that in mind also. U.S. Northern Command was established October 1st, 2002, to provide command and control of the Department of Defense, Homeland Defense efforts and to coordinate defensive support of civil authorities. U.S. Northcom defends America's homeland, protecting our people, national power, and freedom of action. So homeland is a term that they use, which they're trying to convert America and the United States into this term homeland. So names are very important, of course. The United States of America has a constitution. It has an elected government and all these other things. Homeland is just something that they're cooking up. It's also what the Nazis referred to their government as. Homeland isn't connected through its name with the Constitution, with a democratic republic, etc. The United States Northern Command defends our homeland, deters, detects, and defeats threats to the United States, conducts security cooperation activities with allies and partners, and supports civil authorities, air, land, and sea approaches. It also includes the Gulf of Mexico, the Straits of Florida, portions of the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. They're spread out across the hot zone. And the idea of getting anything major in the hot zone in terms of excavations and things like that, you can see why they have such intense control over these areas. And they can do it under the guise of, hey, we're trying to block drug running. We're trying to block gun running. We're trying to block immigrants, But in the meantime, people who are doing that kind of scientific research on the ground are under these intense NDAs saying, if you see anything down there, you can't report it. So how do you get a story like that out? All you can do is hope for some kind of a breakthrough and have the background of the information as we provide here on this program so that we understand it. Zalitsky's work, of course, is a breakthrough there. She saw all of these ancient ruins. We've got her stuff on record before they chased her out of there. So we know it. So it becomes very much like this concept of stealth archives, which I point out on this program often. Stealth archives are like the JFK assassination files. We know that they're there, but we can't get our hands on them, right? And, I've pointed out this very interesting conversation that Judge Napolitano went on record saying he talked to President Trump when he was supposed to release the thing. He was supposed to release all the files. And he had actually promised Napolitano he was going to do this. And he was mandated by law to do it. And he said, well, the CIA came in and I can't do it. And Napolitano said, what do you mean you can't do it? You have to do it. Don't treat the public like children. And he said, Andrew, if you understood what was in those files, there's no way you couldn't do it. So whatever it is, whatever is left in there, although we've understood it to be something that, hey, they could have always altered the records, big deal, there's nothing going to be in there. In fact, there may have been a mechanism that the Kennedys themselves left in those records where something would come out if anything were to happen to them. So that's what could be such a powerful secret that even Trump, from his position so recently, would not release these records. It's extraordinary. So stealth archives are something which we know exist, but we can't get our hands on them. And we know on record they exist. It's not even that they're suggested. We know that they're there. And the official institutions say, yeah, it's there. Just like, yeah, we have this information on the UFO file, but you can't see it. But guess what? It's a threat, and the CIA is going to save you from it. This is the paradigm that we find ourselves in. We're going to have to get out of that. And on the UFO side, all you have to do to get out of that is the UFO researchers don't work with the CIA. People may come in who are CIA who are pretending to be something else, yes, but you don't openly work with the overt CIA. That's stupid, right? Even they would think that's stupid. They probably think that whole field is idiotic for doing it, or desperate, because they have made them desperate. And that's another important piece. Everyone, I also want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. And it keeps us in touch through this intense censorship that we've been seeing throughout social media. And of course, it affects all of us on a regular basis, whether it's shadow banning or outright pulling of episodes. I know they pulled an episode that we did with Millie Weaver, who was a documentary filmmaker, and she was on InfoWars. She's done a lot of stuff, and it was a great episode. I still have no idea after going through that episode why they did that, but this is the randomness of it. It's here today, gone tomorrow. So make sure that you and I are signed up together on that, because if you and I can get together on this, and we'll have a direct pipeline through the newsletter, and that's kind of the best way for us to go. Of course, I encourage you to subscribe and support the work that we do here on this program as well. And we appreciate all your support, and the people who've done Super Chat tonight as well. Very much appreciated. We're going to take a couple of quick pieces here. I'm going to lay out, and then we're going to leave it. But we have the Havardian saying the most exciting time of the week is 5 p.m. Friday, and seeing the YouTube notification for an episode with DJ. Thank you. Love you. Great work and community. Together we can turn 2022 into the year of freedom. Wow. Isn't that fantastic? I absolutely 100% agree. And, it makes a good point as well, which is we create so much of the reality that we're in that we want to really make sure that we are doing our best, not operating with blinders on, but doing our best to kind of keep our own attitude in the heart of development and opening things up. There's a whole level of information that we can access ourselves. No government organizations, no CIA disclosure, none of that. We can access this information ourselves through our interlocking connections with each other. We have the ability to do that. And let's make sure we take that route as we go through here. So that's pretty much it for tonight's show. What I'm going to do is show you a couple of quick things. Yeah, this is another thing. April Haynes, of course, I've been pointing her out quite a bit, who was the deputy CIA director to John Brennan under Obama, and it's a very unusual character in general. I can say that. But one of the interesting things in relation to Avril is that she has really come forward as the point person along with Kirsten Gillibrand on the UFO file. So here we have National Intelligence Director considers if UFO reports could be aliens. Now, she started to use the term aliens, which is something that the CIA directors and intelligence directors just don't do. That's quite a dramatic shift in the language itself. So Avril Haines and Gillibrand and Rubio, those are the three to watch. They keep adding them on. They just had this guy Carson on Ancient Aliens talking about it. He's a congressman. And here we have this respectable congressman saying, hey, check me out on Ancient Aliens. Something weird is going on, right? This guy has no background for aliens. Ruben Galejo there in Arizona, the congressman we pointed out, who's had several sort of name and ID changes over time and was here at Harvard, but studying psychological operations and crowd control, things like that. These are not the people you want around the UFO file. But Galejo and his new guys is Mr. like UAP, we need the truth on this. And, it's become a passion for them. Where are these people coming from? Did they ever write, how about a letter to the editor about UFOs somewhere in their career? High school yearbook? Something. Do you have any background in the UFO file? Ruben Galejo? Congressman Carson? Kirsten Gillibrand? Well, you did have those interesting connections to Nexium, and you had those connections to the aerospace piece. But where are these people coming with the great interest in Senator Rubio? Why is he so interested in UFOs? What is the line that they're being told in the back rooms about where this is going, that they want so desperately to be on the cutting edge when they would have run even a year or two ago from the very idea? Why did Hillary Clinton want to create this entire thing with DeLong and Elizondo and all that stuff that fell apart because Trump got in office? And so TTSA stumbled around and spent $50 million in CIA money. What is the nature of what's happening there in the back rooms where they're saying, get on board with this because it's going to be the thing. They're going to create a defense corridor for it because it's a UFO threat. Avril Haines is out there. Former CIA directors are out there. They all want to talk about aliens all of a sudden and the threat. Why? We have to think about that one. Everyone, it's great having you all here. I'm going to do some shout outs here as we close out tonight. And remember, we're coming back in February with some very powerful interviews. But these X series episodes in the hot zone that are going to really blow things away and put some very exciting things on the record. All right, so here we go. Is Alex Jones, Bill Hicks? No, Bill Hicks was really funny, though. He was amazing. Extraordinary. And he does kind of look like Alex Jones, but it ain't him. Ivan Langley. Thank you very much. Love you guys and gals. Appreciate you now more than you know. Thank you. PBR Street Gang. Thank you. Someone says Rumble. I like that. Oh, I forgot I can do that. I can highlight these now. Now we're talking. I want to thank Carolyn Goida out there for running the Ideas Room tonight. Really excellent, amazing job. She's doing so incredible things behind the scenes. Nicholas Tengoras, a cult fan. It's great to see you out there, sir. Much love as always. Dark Truth. Thank you. I appreciate that. I can tell you the questions and the ideas and the flow of information in the Ideas Room is remarkable. I've never seen anything like it during any live shows. And I've watched these others, and we really have something extraordinary here in that back and forth. And for sure, Miss Olivia brings a lot of that out when you're asking questions. But wow, just an extraordinary group. Gigi Abby Lynn. It's great to see you out there. Good evening, gentlemen. Sarcastic Warlock. It's a great name. Let's face it. Great work, DJ. 1018 Pilt. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Fantastic. It's only getting bigger. I agree. Well, you can feel the snowball effect. Somehow it's like that snowball rushing down a hill and coming in from all these different sides. I think that people really have had it with so many of the mandates and the things coming from on high, and the deep state really dancing in their face. There's something fundamental, and I think that what we're seeing in relation to the convoy in Canada really speaks to that dramatically. Thank you, April. Really appreciate it. Alien Scientist is out there. It's great to see you. There he is. Loving the X-Protect info, DJ. Keep digging. Thank you. X-Protect is crucial. This is a crucial piece. Information on a government level, a lot of it is controlled by groups that live and thrive, and their everyday reality is secrecy. That's what they do. And then the level at which, or the depth to which they will go in order to keep those things hidden or to spin them in a particular direction include destroying careers and, completely fudging the narrative and manipulating the press, manipulating the science, manipulating the backgrounds. And in some cases, we've seen, as I mentioned with Morris Jessup, completely and utterly lethal means used to take that down. And you might say, well, this is one researcher there in the late 50s. This guy, let me tell you something. This guy is the roommate of J. Manson Valentine. J. Manson Valentine does what? He finds the Bimini Road. Okay, so when you're getting into the Jessup story and his death, you're getting into the cover-up of the technology. And what was he so into? As well, what was he bringing out? What was happening? It was the Philadelphia experiment. Those pieces, of course, which we always have that connection with T.T. Brown for, those pieces together help us understand in a much better, deeper way. And that's why X-Protect is so crucial and so important. And we're getting there. I think we're getting to start to understand them. Am new but awake. Thank you. Fantastic. Barbara Leeds Snyder, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, let's see what we got here. Excellent. Fantastic. Jonathan Keener, very professional as usual. Thank you. Very much obliged. Debbie McAdoo. Nat Geo keeps bringing up nuclear hot zone. Why? This is important. You've probably been seeing hot zone around. Here's an interesting thing. Hot zone, the title was used in an early 90s book describing an area where they were developing the Ebola, where Ebola developed in Zaire. And so there is this, overlay from this book that this guy wrote at the time about it. This hot zone is obviously not related to anything about that. However, what's interesting is ever since we started to do this, it's just this kind of bizarre coincidence, everything about the hot zone used in a different relation has been coming out. So as if, to say, hey, there's already this other thing about it, and cloud the public's attention on that. Well, however you want to call it, whatever they're doing down there in that Bahamas area off the coast of Florida and between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba, is you're not allowed to be able to witness those ruins and talk about them. I think that's really significant. And the people who've talked to me about it were involved, and I think this is easy enough to say, they were involved with mapping the ocean floor. And as a result of that, their credentials were impeccable. And the things that they told me in relation to it were, what is so convincing about it is beyond just people I've talked to in relation to it, which I think are convincing enough, to find so much of that information and the links there and connecting the dots between the Casey work, Hemingway, the Zink work. If you go back and really find Dr. David Zink's work, he was very close, and he was doing things. Look, on this program, we take psychic information very seriously. He was using psychics to help him find this, but he was scientifically scanning this stuff, and he knew when he got into certain areas of the hot zone that the compass would spin backwards and all this apotheum things would happen that would defy physics. Well, that sounds a lot like the Bermuda Triangle and things. So we're getting echoes there of that. And the question is that a magnetic anomaly that shows up, which is not something that gets talked about? Is it related to the Atlantean technology? Or does it have something to do on the extraterrestrial side? There's so many different questions. And it could be something that takes place in nature down there that completely defies any magnetic signature or energetic signature that we're familiar with. And that's why they study it so closely, but they don't want everybody to do it. America may want to be in there doing it. They don't want Venezuela and Russia and China in there as well, but all those guys are down there too. So this is what we're looking at over and over again. Fantastic. Esoteric gold. Got to wake up early to go skiing. It's going to be a sunny one. Yes. Wouldn't that be great? Apparently everyone's going to be skiing around here in a couple of hours because there's a major Kapow snowstorm going down. Catherine Harris, Beatnik Professor. That's pretty good. Golden Girl. Stephanie Ramirez. Wow. Gypsy Moon. What was that? Ancient Aliens did an episode on the TTSA because Hillary is floating a run in 2024, and that has been her op all along. There's no question about it. She was pushing, really because of Podesta. Podesta is really the one to watch around Hillary. He's a guy who is deeply into the UFO file and coming from that whole CIA place on it. Fantastic. Corky Goss, Luke Walker, Golden Girl. Why did they change music A440? That's very interesting. Oh, that's a deep question. And they did. They changed the whole paradigm around how music is played and understood. That's a deep one. I would say there was a reason for that. And we know when we get into this, there are Casey readings that talk about how the pyramids were built, and they were built with sound. So there's no question that there are properties to sound which are completely lost to the modern world. And I think part of that is getting shut out by the music scales and things of this nature being limited as they were eventually. It's great to see Kate out there. Great question, by the way. Buddha Yogi, Dorothy Papineau. Wow, just a great crew. AI music, I agree. Fantastic. Let's see. In a video I saw originally, Gigi posted, this black goo and this guy went over a lot, and I cannot recall those specific things, but that was very weird. And it seemed like, thanks, guys. Wow, Nicholas Tingaris. Some of that, there were some super soldier type people who did talk in a way that was pretty knowledgeable about that, oddly enough, because so many of the super soldier narrators were so freaked out, and it seemed like they were trying to create a reality show or something. But oddly enough, there were a couple of them who talked very authoritatively about that. Najat, it's great to have you out there. And thanks so much for being out there. Quite a flurry. Need to interview Dan Winter. I remember Dan Winter. Very interesting guy. Yeah. Huh. I haven't seen him around much. Cheers from Florida, right there in the hot zone. You're deep into it. Cheers indeed. Thank you so much. What happened to Dr. Farrell? Dr. Farrell's recovering very well. I got a message from him yesterday. In fact, he's home recovering after surgery, and so many of us wish him well, and he's doing better. And we'll give him a good while to recover and get up to strength. He'll let us know when he's back. But I think all those good, he's been floating on all that good energy everyone's been sending him for sure. And Max Spears, that is the guy who died prematurely and talked about this. And what's strange is his death is somehow associated with the black goo. I'm trying to remember the story, but I know that his mother came forward and made some statements about the unusual nature of what had happened there with him. And the story of so many of those people are strange. Some of them married billionaires' daughters. Other of them get thrown in jail. Like the super soldier thing is very unusual. It's a little bit different than the kind of UFO sideshow ops. I think they were running something else there directly out of the military, and we were getting some very interesting and unusual characters. Wow, it's been great out here with everyone. Wow. Daniel Carroll, Catherine Harris, Jetty Monk. Just a great crew tonight in the Ideas Room. We will see you all next week, and there may be some special reports in between if we have some wild things going on as we've been having. But it was great to do the X State of the Union with you tonight. Remember the 3 things to watch: the UFO file, continuity of government, emergency players, and Land Rising, Atlantis Rising. That hot zone piece is going to be very important this year. I always like to do a big pump up to people who are doing great work online. Forbidden Knowledge TV, of course, Alexandra doing great work on her site, and Gigi Young. If you want to really be informed on so many of these X issues, Gigi Young, very, very deep. I've pointed out before that Gigi Young has just been invaluable for the work that we've done in the X series. Of course, we just mentioned Dr. Farrell, incredible body of work that he has. RFK's new book, The Real Anthony Fauci, just extraordinary in relation to that. I have a whole stack of books here I wanted to shout out, but I will save them all for you for next week. Of course, Lion, Tiger, Bear is the great new novel by John Warner, of course, who was a Mellon and came on the program, gave us so much information. We're going to have him come back. Thank you, Kat Goida. I salute you for your work in the Ideas Room tonight. We will be back with you next week, and have a great weekend, everybody. Remember, those truckers, tomorrow is when they are hitting the big time there in Ottawa, and we'll see what Justin Trudeau is going to do. Let's see what part of the emergency bunker he can crawl to. Maybe it changes tune and suddenly remember that he's a servant of the people. You never know. You never know. We will see you all again next week. Thank you so much. And, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends. Oh, I'm supposed to give out our mailing address for those who I get a few of these that are don't want to use PayPal. And the address is Dark Journalist 1770 Massachusetts Avenue, number 238, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02140. So close to lovely Harvard over here. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Buddha Love 77. It's a great year. So much good there. Next, when the mask's off. Yes, take the mask off. Good Lord. Unbelievable. Thank you so much, everyone. We will see you all next week. And have a great weekend. Golden Girl, what's for dinner? That's a good question. There's not much tea left in here. I'll have to figure it out. Maybe a brownie, possibly. Gigi Lynn, Star Wars and AJA. I'll have to get into that one. Thank you, Occult Fan. I'll check that out. Fubar Fighter, great to see you out there. Have a great night.